Okay, so we are live, so let's go ahead and get started. My name is Gregory Moss. I'm co-host with Alessandro Di Cesaris here from the University of Freiburg, Switzerland. So we're happy to welcome everyone back to another installment of our seminar, our online seminar, Being Singular, in which we are considering different perspectives, historical and systematic, on the topic of singularity, or Einzelheit in German. So today, it's our pleasure to invite to hear a talk by Filippo Casati. So I'll just briefly introduce him and then we'll get started. The talk will be about 45 minutes to an hour, and then we'll have 30 to 45 minutes of discussion. And just some housekeeping things. If you have a question, you can either raise your hand physically like this, or you can also raise your hand via the reactions bar, which I think is preferable, or put your name in the chat and I will call on you in order that I see the names. And if you're on YouTube and you're watching us, the live stream, you can also put your question in the chat box, okay? And I'll keep an eye on that as well. Okay, so Filippo Casati, it's wonderful to have you here today.
Thank you very much.
Yes, it's absolutely wonderful to have a fellow dialethist and revolutionary with us in the seminar. So he's an assistant professor at Lehigh University, and this is in Pennsylvania. Yes,
Yeah.
Pennsylvania. Yeah, very good. He is trained in analytic philosophy, but he's a specialist in Heidegger and has interest in Wittgenstein, Deleuze, and a wide variety of other interests. He studied under the luminous Grand Priest. And in the past, he's been a JSPS doctoral fellow. That's the Japanese Society for the Promotion of the Sciences, I believe, at the University of Kyoto. And he was a PhD candidate at St. Andrews. Probably he's best known for his book on Heidegger. This is Heidegger and the Contradiction of Being, a very good but also controversial book published with Routledge in 2021. He co-edited a book also related to Heidegger. It's Heidegger on Logic with Cambridge University Press with Daniel Dahlstrom. And he's written a number of articles. Many of these are co-authored, one of them on Kyoto School. This special interest to me, so I'm also interested in Kyoto School, inconsistent metaphysical dependence cases from the Kyoto School. Anything else I want to say? I think that's about it for the intro. The talk today is the sting of negativity and its cure. So without further ado, please take it away.
Thank you very much, Greg. Let me share my screen and see if it works. Okay, so we share. You should be able to see my slides. Okay. Does this work, guys?
It's perfect.
Yeah, fantastic. Okay. Well, so first of all, thank you for having me here. It's a pleasure. I remember at that point, she was my girlfriend. But my current wife went to see Greg because he was organizing a conference. And Ricky gave a talk about the Kyoto School, and she came back, saying a lot of good stuff about this guy Greg. And I read his articles and his book on ego, and I thought, oh wow, that's really interesting. It's really close to my Heidegger, so it's fantastic to be here. Thank you, Greg, for the invitation. And also thank you for the invitation, Alessandro. It's great to know you better. I'm reading right now your work, and it's a pleasure. So thank you very much. So it's also an honor to present at this venue, not only because the topic you're covering is very, very interesting, but because I have the chance to present in front of, some of my philosophical heroes, Michael, Tony, and Graham will be here in spirit, I guess. Okay, so it's great. So my talk is entitled, as Greg said, The Sting of Negativity and Its Cure. And it's clearly inspired by a similar talk, a similar title of a paper written by Tony and recently published for the European Journal of Philosophy. Okay. Now, my talk will have 5 parts. Hopefully, we will cover all of them. Some of them will be, I will kind of surf over the topics to, spare some time for the for the discussion. But what we're going to cover today is what is recently called the Parmenidean puzzle and its recent solutions. I will talk about Kimia, we talk about Michael. Then I will talk about Tony's approach to the Parmenidean puzzle. In particular, I will talk about something that he calls the antinomy of negation. I will claim that Tony might face some problems in proposing or outlining the antinomy of negation in relation to the Parmenidean puzzle. That's what is the sting of negativity, the pain of having negativity if you are a Parmenidean philosopher. And then I will try to somehow, if I may, help Tony out of these difficulties by suggesting my favorite solution, the passport, the passepartout that opens all possible doors when philosophers get stuck. That is paraconsistency and dialecticism. And then I will conclude with some final remarks. So let me put on the table some methodological remarks before, so you know what you expect and you know what you should not expect. You should not expect the defense of paraconsistency and dialecticism. I take them for granted. Now they have, fortunately, I hope, regardless of what Timothy Williamson might say, a very good reputation in philosophy. So they're good established theories, and I take them for granted right now, in this talk at least. I'm not going to defend the validity of the Parmenidean puzzle, and I'm not going to defend the solution proposed by Tony either. But I will outline and use all these ideas to raise some points that for me are important because they seem to say something about something I'm highly interested in, that is the relation between the principle of non-contradiction and the principle of sufficient reason. Okay, we can start. So the Parmenidean puzzle and its solutions. So in 2018, Kimi Irad published a book entitled Thinking and Being, a very much expected book, anticipated book, because it was in the process for at least 15 years before for Harvard University Press. And this book is about a puzzle. He calls it the Parmenidean puzzle, and the puzzle is grounded on two main assumptions. So the first assumption is that the use of negation and the assessment of a statement as false are perfectly intelligible. So this simply means that when we say the table is not flat or there's no is green, so we use a negation in a statement and we say something false, well, we do understand each other when we say these sorts of things. These statements are, in fact, intelligible. Okay. And the second premise is that there is no logical gap between truly thinking that such and such being the case. Now, this is a convoluted, I take it to be convoluted way of expressing an idea which is familiar to Parmenidean philosophers. And Kimi expressed this idea, or the absence of the logical gap between these two things, in the following way. So at page 6, he claims that thinking, if you believe Parmenides is right, reaches all the way to being, or that thinking reaches all the way to that which is the case. So if you are Parmenidean, you cannot think about what is not the case. You cannot think about non-being. Now, the most comprehensive and intelligible discussion of these ideas, to me, appear in the first chapter of the Parmenidean Ascent. So if you want to have a review of these ideas, then the Parmenidean Ascent first chapter is the best place to go. Now, of course, Kimi immediately noticed, but is not doing anything particularly original at this point. He notices that, well, 2 and 1 don't go together. And that's exactly the puzzle. So the truth of 1, he claims, rules out the possibility, the truth of 2, rules out the possibility of 1. Why? For the following reason. So suppose you have a true statement, and the true statement in question is the snow is white. So it is the case that the snow is white. Now, if it is the case that the snow is white, and thinking reaches all the way to being, all the way to what is the case, then there is no problem in claiming and thinking that the snow is indeed white. But then suppose we are handling judgments which are true, but negative. So the snow is not green, Or suppose we are claiming something evidently false, that is, the snow is green. Well, then we have a problem. Why? Because usually we understand these statements as being about something that is not the case. So when we claim that the snow is not green, we claim that something is not the case. That is, it's not the case that the snow is green. And when we start to think about something that is evidently false, like the snow is green, then we're thinking about something that is not the case. Well, what? That the snow is green. Okay, but of course, if it is true that we cannot think about what is not the case, that our thinking reaches all the way to being, then we shouldn't be able to claim intelligibly that the snow is not green and the snow is green. That's, in a nutshell, the Parmenidean puzzle. Okay, and Kimi is very clear about this, and he claims that both of these puzzles, that is, the one about true judgments but negative and false, are concerned with saying or thinking something that is not, that is therefore nothing. But we shouldn't be able to do that if the second assumption of the aforementioned puzzle is true. Okay. Now, Kimi thinks this is pivotal for philosophy, and he thinks that this puzzle is neglected by contemporary philosophers. I am not sure it is. It seems to me that a lot of the debate about Meinung and Russell and neo-Meinungianism, in a sense, it's about this. So I don't think analytic philosophers neglect this paradox, but he thinks that it's not explored enough, especially by logicians. Again, I'm not sure that's true. Towards non-being by Grand Prix seems a counterexample to this. But I think Kimi is right in saying that if we take this puzzle seriously, then a lot of things that we do in logic might appear to be problematic. I mean, think about the principle of non-contradiction, A and not A, right? Not A is a negative judgment. So, you know, it's kind of important. Logic is grounded on classical, especially on the exclusiveness and exhaustiveness of true and falsity. But then you have false propositions, false statements. And again, this constitutes a problem if you take the Parmenidean puzzle seriously. So what's the solution proposed by Kimi? Okay, the first thing that Kimi does, which is very interesting, and it's somehow in line or coherent with a lot of things that have been recently done by the Chicago School and the Leipzig School. So I have in mind Pippin on one side and Rödel on the other one, is to reject Frege's difference between content and force, and they reject it as unintelligible. So Kimi, in his, I think, in the second chapter of his book, has these arguments which employ the principle of sufficient reason in order to show that the difference, which is stipulated by Frege between content and force, is unjustified without any reason and therefore unintelligible. Now, this is important for him because he wants to deny that there is an external relation between content and force given a certain thought, which seems to suggest exactly that the second understanding of the second premise of the Parmenidean puzzle, it is the case, because the difference between content and force is exactly meant to give to Frege and to us the possibility to think about something that is not the case. Something that is true, it is the case, and then you need force to do that in terms of a thought. But the content itself doesn't say anything about if what you are thinking, it is the case or not. And of course, Kimi, as a good Parmenidean, wants to resist this idea because he wants to make the Parmenidean puzzle particularly cogent. So if you buy into this line of thought, the difference of Frege, introduced by Frege, is not compatible with 2, and this is why Kimi wants to reject it. Now, then Kimi argues that far from introducing a difference, or what he calls the categorematic difference, or a difference in content between true judgments and true negative judgments or false judgment, he believes that the difference between these two kinds of judgments is syncategorematic. So what does it mean for him that this difference is syncategorematic? It means that there is a relation between true judgments on one end and true negative judgments and false judgments on the other end. But this relation is internal. And he takes this internal relation to suggest that There is no difference between true judgments and true negative judgments and false judgments in terms of determination. They are about the same determination, or, he says, they are about the same content. So this looks weird, I admit it, but give me 1 second, I'll try to make it as intelligible as I can. Okay, so Kimi tries to introduce this syncategorematic difference between true judgments on the one hand and true negative judgments and false judgments on the other by appealing to 4 notions: repeatability, unity, dominance, and the priority of the positive. We can discuss about all these concepts. They're really not important for us. What is important, though, is that if you have a true judgment, this true judgment, according to Kimi, displays a proposition, that is, points at something that it is the case. But if you have true negative judgments or false judgments, these judgments do not point at anything, or if they do, they display the same things that true propositions display. They just apply to that, so to speak, content, positive content, an assertoric gesture. So what does this mean? It means that if you have the snow is white, then no problem, because we are Parmenidean philosophers, and it is the case that the snow is white, so I can think and speak about that, because it is the case. But suppose I claim that the snow is green, then I'm saying something false, and I'm actually not referring to anything that is not the case. I'm just thinking and referring to something that it is the case. That is the determination, the content of my thought, which is exactly the same content and determination of the snow is white. But what I do when I claim that the snow is green is to think at that state of affair, that thing that is the case, and say, no, reject it. That's the assertoric gesture that Kimi has in mind. This allows him to keep true that when you think about falsity, you still think about something positive, and therefore avoid the puzzlements of the 2 assumptions previously explained. The same happens with true negative judgments. When I say that the snow is not green, I'm actually referring to something that it is the case, that is, the snow is white, but I just claim that I don't know what is really the case. So there is a layer of indeterminacy, epistemic indeterminacy between me and what is the case. But even when I say true negative judgments like the snow is not green, what I'm thinking, even though I don't know exactly what I'm thinking, I'm still thinking about something positive. Again, Parmenides is happy. Okay. Now, after publishing this book, which appeared to me highly incomprehensible at the beginning, it took me a lot of months to read Kimi's book and try to understand something, I bumped into De La Rocca's paper on Kimi, and after reading Michael's paper, I thought, oh dear, I do understand Kimi now. Maybe I can work on it. So thanks, Michael. That was very helpful for me. Okay. And Michael's engaged with this book because Michael is a Parmenidean too, see the Parmenidean ascent, but he thinks that Kimi faces some problems and he proposes an alternative solution. The alternative solution is way more radical than Kimi's one, as we will see in a second. So Michael thinks that Kimi is right in rejecting Frege's difference between content and force as unintelligible. So Michael does this in the Parmenidean ascent, but he does this, I would say, really compellingly for me, or more compellingly than what is usually done on this distinction by Pippin, Rödel, and Kimi, in his The Original Sin of Analytic Philosophy. Is that the right title, Michael? Yeah, okay, that's great. Okay, so if you have the chance, read this paper, it's great. I'm sure you're already familiar with it. However, Michael argues that Kimi faces exactly the same problem of Frege when he introduces the syncategorematic difference. Why? Because as the difference introduced by Frege, the difference between content and force, also the difference introduced by Kimi is, in fact, arbitrary, not grounded, and therefore unintelligible. Therefore, Kimi faces the same problem, stumble upon the same problem Kimi himself attributes to Frege. So if we are unhappy with Frege, Michael concludes, we should be unhappy with Kimi too. And I agree. Now, because Michael is a pretty radical thinker, as we all know, this is, I guess, why we like him, the idea of Michael is, well, maybe the problem is not that we are introducing a relation here, a specific relation. Maybe the problem is that we are introducing a relation. Maybe the problem is that we have a relation, in this case, relation between force and content, or true judgments or true negative judgments and false judgments. So what if relations per se are unintelligible? And that's, I think, the art of the Parmenidean ascent. So when he reads Kimi, he's just applying the Parmenidean ascents to Kimi and the domain of logic, because this is what Kimi is interested in. And if relations are intelligible, then, well, it's not that we are in the business of saving logic. We are in the business of trashing logic, of throwing logic out of the windows, because logic is relational. Come on. Negation is a relation, conjunction is a relation, disjunction is a relation, syllogisms are relations, right? Inferences are relations, true and false are a relational concept. So what do we do with all this? If relations are intelligible, well, we just throw it away. So as he does in his book, let's climb the ladder of logic until logic itself discloses that logic is attainable, and live without it. So logic itself is unintelligible. So if we want to be consistent with Parmenides, and we want to take very seriously the idea that the Parmenidean puzzle is indeed a puzzle, it is puzzling us, then how do we fix that problem? Just eliminating relations and eliminating logic. So it's not that there is thinking and there is being, there is thinking and being, because they are the same as everything else. There is only one, and maybe we cannot even say that there is only one thing, because it would imply relations, or at least abstract relations, with 2, 3, 4, and so on and so forth. But surely there are no relations. Now, this is how we stay, what we face when we read what has been done around Kimi's book, given what is interesting for me. A lot of other things have been done with Kimi's book. So let's compare Kimi and Michael for 1 second. So Kimi thinks, and here it's completely Platonic, that we need to sodzenta phenomena. We need to save the phenomena. The world is phenomenical. The world contains multitudes, contains fancy things. That's undeniable, as it is undeniable that negative judgments make sense, false judgment makes sense. Among the things that there are also things that are true, there are also things that are false. It's absolutely bankers to throw away logic. And how does he do it? Well, introducing a syncategorematic difference. It is this difference, the syncategorematic difference, which allows him to have a logical space, which is nonetheless consistent with all the Parmenidean requirements. On the other hand, you have Michael, and Michael goes like, no, 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 nothing about sodzenta phenomena, forget Plato, we don't care about that, that's just gibberish, it's just an illusion, there is nothing like multitude, there is only one, let's go mystical. And if we throw away multitudes, well, we need to throw away all kinds of differences and multitudes, including the one that we need to develop a logical space. So let's throw away the logical space, or at least the logical space which requires relations to exist. And therefore, there is this sort of slowly but inevitably vanishing of the logical space. There is nothing left. Of course, these two positions are incompatible, not only because one rejects the other, but because the very outcome is different, right? Because Kimi can still look outside the window and say, look how many things there are in the world, and some things I can say about the world are true and some are false, and Michael can't do that anymore. Regardless of the counterintuitive conclusion of Michael, I still think, even though I disagree with Michael, Michael knows that, I still think that if I need to choose philosophically between Kimi and De La Rocca, I would go for De La Rocca because the arguments are better. Okay. Now, after a while, so 2018, I don't remember when Michael published his paper on the EJP, but I think maybe one year later or 2 years later, Tony publishes a reply to both Kimi and Michael. And this is going to be the art of the talk. So what we have done until now is just quick background. So Tony is interesting, very interesting, I think. It's a fascinating thinker. And he proposes in many different books and articles something called hermeneutic realism. He does it in a book published in 2016. My German is not fluent enough. It took me ages to read it. It was pretty painful. I did it. And then there is a very, very beautiful paper collected in an edited volume entitled Is Hermeneutic Realism Dialectical Material? Is Hermeneutic Realism a Dialectic Materialism? Okay. So hermeneutic realism has four tenets, so to speak. One is the subjectivity thesis, the second one is the readability thesis, the third is a threefold structure of truth, and the fourth one is the antinomy thesis. Even though Tony has a continental background, all these assumptions, tenets have been discussed by analytic philosophers. There is a beautiful discussion in the last book by Thomas Hoffaber about the subjectivity thesis. I think that's one of the most exhaustive discussion of Tony's ideas recently published in analytic philosophy. And what we're going to do today is to focus on two in particular. One is the readability thesis, we will call it RT, and the other one is the antinomy thesis, we will call it AT. In particular, we will focus on the antinomy thesis because I think that it might create some problem to Tony's approach to the Parmenidean puzzle. Now, what does the antinomy thesis say? It says this. This thesis, the antinomy thesis, states that thought as such, in its empty basic position, is contradictory in itself. And indeed, incurably contradictory. As a dialetheist, when I read incurably near a contradiction, I become immediately happy, extremely happy. It's like giving me coffee in the morning, I wake up. Because, Tony adds, thought bears the antinomy of reflexive negativity. So of course, this is a very different quotation, but superficially at least what we learn is that, well, thinking seems to bump into a contradictory, seems to be contradictory. Such a contradictory is incurably. It cannot be removed. There is no hierarchy you can appeal to remove this contradiction. It's there, it's meant to stay. Good luck. Deal with it. And this contradiction surface bubble ups in our thinking when we talk about the antinomy of reflexive negation. So in what follows, I will try to unpack this idea, which is, I'm not an Hegelian, but it looks very Hegelian to me under certain respects. So it looks also somehow drifting towards Greg's work, if I may. But in a sense, what follows is me trying to unpack what this means. Okay. Now, the first thing that Tony does is to distinguish between object language and meta language. If you are an analytic philosopher, then you are familiar with this distinction. There's nothing awkward about it. Object language, Tony thinks, is things like the snow is white, the snow is not green, the snow is green. And a meta language is things like, if I say in the object language that the snow is white, well, meta-linguistically, what I'm saying is that it is the case that the snow is white. Now, Tony thinks that we can avoid the paradox or the puzzle of Parmenides by appealing to a very, very similar strategy, a strategy that is very similar to Kimi's strategy. And the only difference, I believe, at this point between the two is exactly the introduction between object language and meta language, with Tony, this is in the EJP paper, sells, and I think he is right, as way more appealing than the difference between categorematic and syncategorematic difference. And the reason why I think Tony is right about this is that we are familiar with this distinction, while we're less familiar, I believe, with the distinction between syncategorematic and categorematic. But what Tony does at this point is exactly, in a sense, what Kimi does, just in a clearer way, I believe. So for instance, when the snow is not green, and we say it is the case that the snow is white, then when we say that the snow is not green, then we think about something that it is the case, that the snow is white, and then there is this layer of epistemological indeterminacy. Exactly like Kimi, when we say that the snow is green, well, what we are actually thinking when we understand that the snow is green is that the snow is white, but we are rejecting it. Okay, so again, I'm not defending this position. I'm saying that this is what was endorsed by Tony and Kimi at the same time. So there is a sense in which the object language distinction, the object language and meta language distinction is exactly the same distinction that Kimi calls categorematic and syncategorematic. Okay, now Kimi does more than that though. Tony does more than that though. He thinks that the difference between object language and meta language is grounded on something. And in grounding on something very specific, that is, the things we have around us. So the difference between object language and meta language has a secure foundation in re. And when he says in re, he means it. He means in the thing, like the pen, the book, the table, the chair, things around us. Why? Because when I look at my beautiful armchair, then the armchair is not given to me just as an object, but it comes to me in a linguistic form, almost as a linguistic token. It appears to me as being there rather than here, big rather than small. It appears to me linguistically given, so to speak. Every time I try to sort of unpack this idea, I think about the Pittsburgh School. I think about something like McDowell. It's you know, I think there are at least analogies. The reality comes to us conceptualized, linguistically given. And in a sense, this is what Tony claims. When we perceive things, we take them to be tokens of singular propositions about them. We read them like inscriptions, really like inscriptions. We read them. And can translate them into verbal propositions if necessary, but they nonetheless come to us linguistically. But in coming to us linguistically, then we bump into something that he calls qualitative constituents of consciousness, qualia, right? Things are given to us. There are these qualitative constituents, are given to us linguistically, but there are these qualitative constituents, these qualia. And these qualia, Tony thinks, are enigmatic exactly because they reveal the identity of the act of thinking with the content which is thought. So when I bump into these qualia, so to speak, thinking and being are really the same. There is no difference. And Tony proposes that what happens between the object language and the meta language, which is in turn grounded in the things around us, is the I cognitive, what he calls the I cognitive states. Our ability to say certain things or not about the armchair and the world. There is thinking and there is being, and there is a perfect correspondence between the two. This allows us to say certain things rather than others. But then there is the S cognitive cognitive state, which grounds the I cognitive state, which make possible for us to say what we say about things. And this is what we bump into when we bump into, for instance, qualia. And there, it's not that there is thinking perfectly corresponding to being, but thinking and being are the same. And therefore linguistic articulation becomes impossible. So let's step back for a second. So we have chemi, the logical space, syncategorematic difference, the possibility of saying true statements, true negative judgments, and false judgments. Then we have Michael Della Rocca saying, no, you can do all these things. You just give up everything, because there is at least something which escapes our ability to convey things, to say things. And then there is Tony, and Tony is interesting in this debate because he seems to have both. So chemi becomes his I cognitive states, this possibility of saying that the armchair is there and flat and big rather than small and not flat or smooth. And there is a logical space. This is what the I cognitive is. The states in which we reason, we think, and we express ideas linguistically. We articulate linguistical thoughts. And then we have also the version of the one, the pure being, Michael would say, that is the S cognitive, where these distinctions are not there anymore as distinctions. So, you know, Tony's Coq should appear appealing if you kind of agree with Michael's arguments, but at the same time you want to save the world because you kind of care about what's going on outside your window. Okay. Now, what is interesting here, and this is really interesting for us, I think, is that Tony thinks that if we have the S cognitive states and the I cognitive states, and the S cognitive states are somehow the ground of the I cognitive states, then a good question is, how do we end up having I cognitive states? How do we move from the S cognitive states, this pure identity of thinking and being? How do we go from there, from this sort of realm in which distinctions are not there as distinctions, to the realm of distinctions, which allows us to say something? How do we go there, right? And the idea here is that we're not interested in how did we do it historically, pragmatically. Oh, look, I bump into stuff, I see a cow, and I point the finger towards the cow. No, no, no. What is the logical explanation? Can we have an argument which allows us to explain how we go from S to I? That's the challenge here. And Tony thinks, I believe he's right about that, that if we try to explain that movement from S to I, then we face an antinomy. That's Tony's point. And I find this very compelling. Again, I'm not sure I find the whole story compelling. But if you grant that there is an S cognitive state and an I cognitive state, then I find compelling the view that if you want to explain that movement, then you will bump into an antinomy. Now, I really tried hard, and Tony might correct me about this, please do. I tried hard to find in Tony's work an argument for why this antinomy is generated. And I didn't find it, or I didn't find it so clearly in a sense. It's there, I know it's there, but I wanted to make it more salient, especially for philosophers or for analytic philosophers, which might be interested in these things. So this is how I reconstruct the antinomy in question. Let's see if it makes sense to you and to Tony as well. So suppose from the I cognitive states, I want to say something about the S cognitive states. Well, and I must, if I am in the business of explaining how we go from S to I. If I want to explain how we go from S to I, and I am in I because I'm talking, right? And in S, I couldn't talk. I was not able to talk. Then I must be able to talk about S. Otherwise, I wouldn't be able to explain how we go from S to I. If I want to explain how we go from S to I, and I must be able to explain and to talk about S from within the I cognitive state, because that's where my language is. Okay, now, and suppose I want to characterize, that's the beginning of our explanation, right? I want to characterize the S cognitive state, because I want to say that we go from there to here, from S to I. Okay, then I must explain or convey something about S cognitive. In particular, I must convey that there are no propositions. There are no propositional facts. There can't be, exactly because it's not that thinking corresponds to being, but thinking is being. We are in Michael's land, pure being. We are enlightened. Okay, now, if this is the case, it is because of the readability thesis and the qualia thesis. These are the two cards that Tony plays in order to claim that that is the case. It is the case that in S cognitive there aren't propositions or propositional facts, exactly because of the readability thesis, which is a bridge towards the qualia thesis, which is a bridge towards the idea that what grounds the I cognitive states is the S cognitive states, that is this identity of thinking and being, which does not allow us to have propositions or propositional facts. So that has to be true, right? But keep in mind that one is a true negative judgment, because we are saying that there are no propositions. We are saying that there are no propositional facts. Now, according to Tony's account of negation, here I mean, according to Tony's account of true negative judgments, we must analyze that judgment as metalinguistically. Therefore, we must analyze it as it is the case that something, and then the assertoric gesture of Kimming, which says, no, that's not the case. But that's exactly what we cannot do if we want to characterize the S cognitive style, because in the S cognitive status, because in the S cognitive status, we don't have any propositional fact, neither positive nor negative. And here is the paradox indeed. So it is the case, if it is the case that from within the cognitive styles, it is true that there are no propositions, and it is the case that from within the I cognitive status, there is at least a proposition which in fact characterize as cognitive, then there must be and not be such proposition such that I'm willing and able to say something about S and to characterize S as such. Now, this seems convoluted, but it's not if you think about familiar paradoxes in logic. Okay, so let me skip 1 second and then we go back. So think about how, we don't need to go in details, this is logic, so it doesn't matter. But believe me, and in the Q&A we can discuss about it, that you can recast this problem of not being able to say anything about X, where X in this case are these S cognitive states, as a paradox of denotation, which is a version of Koenig's paradox, for instance, which is a self-referential paradox, which is so to speak, that has a structure of an enclosure scheme. Okay, we can come back to this. We will if you want, but let me continue for 1 second. Okay. Now, if it is true, and I think it is true, that in order to explain the S cognitive states, the movement from the S to the I cognitive states, then we face an antinomy, then we need to understand how Tony wants to handle this antinomy. So what do we do with this antinomy now? And Tony claims two things. He claims, one, that the antinomy of negation can be seen as expressing the logical ontological singularity of absolute negativity in which all logical principles break down. So when we bump into this antinomy by explaining the movement between S and I, then something goes really wrong with our logic. So wrong that our logics break down. Okay. And the second thing that Tony claims is that the antinomy of negation is there to stay, but it is nevertheless unacceptable. So he has this sort of conflict between, oh gosh, I really deduce an inference here. I really get it. I can't avoid it. What I'm doing is just right. Sound premises and good, valid inferences. And nonetheless, I can't accept it. Okay. And what is very interesting for us is that on the one hand, he thinks that that antinomy leads you to a breakdown of our logic. And on the other hand, that antinomy is meant to stay. I mean, a logician would say, you cannot parameterize it away. There is no way you can remove it. And nonetheless, it's unacceptable. And I think that these two claims about the antinomy of negation represents a problem for Tony. Okay. Now, what are these problems? Okay, the first worry is this one. So everything started because it seems to me that, everything started because the Parmenidean puzzle was puzzling. Why was puzzling? Well, because we seem to be able to use negation, and sometimes, well, we don't. Why? Well, because of assumption 2 of the Parmenidean puzzle. Because we shouldn't be able to think about what is not the case, and negation forces us to think about what is not the case. Now, Kimi and Michael and Tony are in the business of making this puzzle less puzzling. But if at the end we reach a conclusion according to Tony, according to which, well, there is still a negation, this sort of absolute negation, this very weird negation which happens at the sort of at the border of the I cognitive, or at the border between the S and the I. If when negation reaches that limit, then we are stuck with a contradiction, and this contradiction is somehow unacceptable, and nonetheless we can remove it. And it seems to me that the negation remains puzzling. It's just that a very specific negation remains puzzling. So if the point of Tony was to overcome the paradox, the puzzle of Parmenides, then in a sense he does it, but not completely, right? Because there is at least one negation that remains puzzling. The negation, which he calls absolute negation, the one that happens on the border. Of course, Tony can say that, well, I mean, I did fix a lot of problems. All the sort of everyday relative negations are still out there. I can speak about the snow is not green and being happy about that. It's true. Negation it remains puzzling when it's, so to speak, at its limits, when it becomes absolute. Yeah, I guess that he can say that, but it's still the case that in the spirit of what Michael and Kimi did before, the goal is not to fix partially the paradox or the puzzle. The goal is to fix it. And I think Tony gets very close to it, but as it states the approach, it doesn't really fulfill the goal that I think we are in the business of. Now, the second worry is this one. It's not very clear to me what does it mean for an antinomy to stay and still be unacceptable. So I did study logic, and it seems to me that, when a contradiction stays, it means that you infer it logically, in a logically valid way, and from premises which are true. This means for a contradiction to stay. I don't have any reason to think that the contradiction must stay if I think that either the premises are false or the argument is invalid. In that case, the antinomy wouldn't stay. It would go away. This is what usually logicians does when they bump into paradoxes. What it has been done when they bump into paradoxes of, let's say, naive set theory. So it's not clear to me what does it mean to stay without being acceptable. Because for me, a contradiction which stays, it's a contradiction which, spoiler alert, is just true. And it seems to me that Tony is aware of this difficulty, and is in his Emory lectures, which are very beautiful and they cover a lot of ground, and I really enjoy them. He says, well, you know, in a sense, the antinomy is meant to stay as death is meant to stay. We really don't like death, and, you know, nonetheless, it's gonna destined to stay. And I think, yeah, I get it, but, you know, accepting death and accepting contradictions, they look very different to me. Very different things. One is clearly a propositional attitude. I mean, I accept a proposition which is a conjunction of a statement and its negation. And the other one is some sort of existential posture towards something that is inevitable for me, that is facing death at some point. So appealing to this sort of more naive everyday understanding of accepting doesn't convince me much. The third problem and the fourth problem that I think Tony faces is the following one. So when you face contradictions, you usually face a problem with logic. Contradictions are logically problematic. Of course, also metaphysically problematic, but logically problematic too. If you're a classical logician and you bump into a contradiction that you have proven, well, you are in big trouble because explosion will follow and everything will become trivial. Now, let's see what Tony then says about logic. So according to Tony, logic is transcendental. This is a word that I use because I find it easy to understand, but I'll tell you in a second what he means with that. And logic is classical. Now, logic can mean a lot of different ways. There is formal logic, there is informal logic. I think what Tony has in mind is some sort of Phrygian logic, because it does talk about ex falso quod libet. It does talk about principle of non-contradiction. He does talk about all these logics as deviant logics, mentioning Dammit and Priest, so intuitionistic logic and paraconsistent logic. And he talks about Frege too as the paradigmatic case of a classical logician. So it seems to me that it's fair to think about what we usually mean with logic nowadays, so symbolic logic or something like that. I grant that Tony might have in mind other kinds of logics too, what in one of our many conversations he calls logic capital L, and I think that might constitute a problem for my approach. But for the moment, let's stick with this. Okay, so why do I think that Tony thinks that logic has to be transcendental and classical, and what does this mean? Okay, let's read this quotation from his EJP paper. What are called deviant logics, deviant with respect to the classical one, of course, such as intuitionistic logic and paraconsistent logic proposed by Graham Priest to deal with seemingly unavoidable contradictions, are not logics for deviant thinking, but calculi for manipulating sign designs in ways that systematically deviate from thinking as such. This is the boldest, bravest characterization of deviant logic I've read in a long time, and I love it. Why I love it? Because finally I can see someone stating things as they think about them, clearly and outgoing. So thank you, Tony. That's great. I loved it. So what does Tony say about this? Well, he says two things, right? So one is that the logic he has in mind is classical. Why? Because he doesn't want to go with the deviant one. And what are the deviant one? Basically all the logics that are not classical, intuitionistic and paraconsistent. Maybe it doesn't cover everything, it covers much, but the very label of deviant logic is a label which is used to characterize kinds of logical systems which are not classical. Okay, and why do I claim that he thinks that logic is transcendental? He thinks the logic is transcendental because when you deviate from logical thinking, you don't think differently, you just don't think at all. When you deviate from classical logic, and you go deviant by dint of deviant logics, intuitionistic or paraconsistent, then it's not that you're just thinking differently. You're not thinking at all. You deviate from thinking as such. And this suggests that his logic is the logic of thinking, not the logic of a way of thinking. In this sense, I think it can be called transcendental. Okay. We are almost done, guys. Be patient. Okay. So, well, okay. So if I think that logic is transcendental, right? And I, like Tony, think that we face an antinomy when we think about the shift between S and I, then I think it is a problem for Tony to say that logic breaks down. Why? Because if logic breaks down, this means that I can draw the limits of my logical thinking. But if I can draw the limits of my logical thinking, it means, Wittgenstein-Dochet, that I can think on what lies on the other side of these limits, which is exactly what you're not supposed to be able to do if logic is transcendental. Because if logic is transcendental, when you don't think logically, you don't think at all. And therefore, you cannot draw the limits of logic if not from within, but then, A, you're not dreaming the limits. In the words, you are drawing limitations, Conan would say, not limits. So this is Conan's all massive paper, massive, I mean it, massive paper about the logical alien, right? That if you take logic to be transcendental in this sense, then every time that you bump into a logical alien, someone who violates this logic, he has in mind Frege and the negation of the principle of identity, but we can imagine Priest with the negation of the principle of non-contradiction, with the claim that some contradictions are true. All these people, all these opponents are not thinking outside logic. They are not thinking at all. Recently in the culmination, Pippin's The Culmination, last book by Pippin, Pippin claims exactly the same thing about Hegel in relation to Heidegger, that if you violate logic, then you express a non-thought. And this is consistent with the resolute reading of Wittgenstein. And I agree with them. If you take logic to be transcendental in that sense, then you can draw the limits of your logical system or your logical thinking. Because drawing the limits would mean stepping outside those limits, looking it from without, and claiming, oh, this is where I stop. And that's exactly what you cannot do if logic is transcendental. Okay. What about logic being classical? Well, I think it's a problem. Why? Because I think Tony is right. I give to Tony everything Tony says as true. I agree that the readability thesis is true. I granted that. I grant the history about qualia. I grant the history about shifting from S to I. I grant that there is an antinomy. And I think what he's done, what he did is not only logically valid, but true, with true premises. I think there is nothing wrong about that. And this is why the antinomy is meant to stay. But if he wants to be classical, and the antinomy is meant to stay, and the antinomy was inferred validly from sound premises, then the system will be immediately trivial because of ex falso quod libet, because we have inferred a contradiction. And then it's not clear how Tony wants to avoid triviality. And he does want to avoid triviality, because if, for instance, he does not want to say that in the I cognitive state, everything is true and false. Now, Tony has a reply, and this reply is, I labeled in my paper, this is a paper that I spent, too much time on it, but because I have this obsessive tendencies, as my wife told me once. But so the idea of Tony is, well, okay, so I can constrain this contradiction, just not logically, but pragmatically in a sense. And I think he has in mind Wittgenstein. So contradiction is this sort of memento mori that you just leave there and you keep doing what you were meant to do and forgetting about them, right? Now, I struggle with this approach as I struggle with the Wittgenstein remark in his observation about mathematics. So Tony says, we must avoid or circumvent the antinomy with practical wisdom as best as we can and try to isolate it logically, to look it up in logical quarantine, so to speak. Right, but if you want logical quarantine, then you must give up ex falso quod libet, because the relation between A and not A and any arbitrary contradiction is not pragmatical. It's not something that you can forget about it and keep going. It's a logical relation driven by a logical principle. And therefore, it's difficult to constrain it pragmatically because the relation suggested by ex falso quod libet is not pragmatical in the first place. And if so, again, it seems to me that not only it's unclear what does it mean to restrain or constrain or put a contradiction in quarantine from a pragmatical point of view or with pragmatical wisdom, I just don't understand how this can be done without a relaxation of ex falso quod libet, since the relation between a contradiction and any other arbitrary proposition is in fact a logical relation more than a pragmatical relation, a relation that we do. So again, I'm not sure that this is a good way to go. And some of these arguments have been outlined by Marconi in one of his wonderful papers about Wittgenstein and paraconsistent logic. Now we are done, guys. My dinosaur cup is almost empty and my talk is almost finished. So yes, you survived. I'm glad. Okay, so do I think Tony is wrong? No, not at all. I think he's right. And this is why I give this paper, because I find his philosophical position convincing. And I think that what he calls the sting of negativity is less stingy than I think he thinks. Maybe there is a way we can cope with this contradiction. And here is how I would do it. So how I would cope with a contradiction is to change the logic and switch from classical to paraconsistent logic. And this is why I put the slide that then I ended up skipping for a question of time. The shift between classical logic and paraconsistent logic will not be arbitrary if we think that the paradox that Tony faces with the antinomy of negation is a version of a denotational paradox, which is a version of, for instance, Koenig's paradox, which are self-referential paradox and then enclosure schemas. Why? Because enclosure schemas are the paradigmatic situations in which people usually want to apply paraconsistent logic and dialectism if they want to apply paraconsistent logic and dialectism in the first place, of course. So the switch of logic is not arbitrary. It's not that Tony faces a problem and then he takes from the toolbox the best tool to nail the spike that doesn't go in. It's not like this. It's a very natural move, exactly because what he presents is a version of a paradox that analytic philosophers and logicians naturally handle with paraconsistent logic if they are sympathetic with paraconsistent logic in the first place, of course. Moreover, I think that a switch from classical logic to paraconsistent logic would help him to address all the four issues I presented before. Okay, let's see why. Let's start from the last one.
Filippo, maybe 5 minutes. Do you think you can finish up?
Absolutely. Yeah. Thank you. Sorry, Greg. Okay, so we have logic, it's transcendental, it's paraconsistent. So why going paraconsistent would help Tony? Well, because if the logic is paraconsistent, you don't need to appeal to any practical wisdom. You don't need to appeal to some sort of Wittgensteinian unclear idea of how to constrain, to put this contradiction in quarantine. Logic will do it for you, exactly because the ex falso quod libet doesn't hold in paraconsistent logic anymore. So you decide that this contradiction goes in quarantine and everything is fine. No practical wisdom involved. There's no need of Wittgenstein anymore, which is always relaxing for me. So the second observation is, well, if logic is transcendental, then Tony can in fact talks about the breaking down of logic. Why? Because what the logic that will break down is the classical one, but not logic itself, right? So Tony can say, well, okay, no problem. I'm not facing the problem of the logical alien. I'm taking transcendental logic to be paraconsistent. And when I take classical logic to be paraconsistent, I can legitimately say that logic can break down because the logic breaking down is the classical one, not the paraconsistent one. So again, the claim that logic breaks down in facing the antinomy of negation is just true, and in an unproblematic way if you go paraconsistent. Now, someone might say, Rödel might say, transcendental logic cannot be paraconsistent because transcendental logic is classical. Okay, that seems to be a petitio principii to me. And there has to be arguments which leads us from the claim that transcendental logic, that logic is transcendental and that logic is classical, and an argument to merge the two. And from what I can read in Rödel, Kimi, and Pippin, I have this in mind because they are about this. This logic, these arguments they presuppose what they shouldn't, that is classical logic. Okay, last two problems. So the other problem we face is that the Parmenidean puzzle didn't sort of vanish completely, but that Tony faces some sort of revenge of the puzzle outlined at the beginning, when negation is not relative but absolute, when negation is about the joining point between S and I cognitive states. And then again, the problem does disappear if you're a paraconsistent logician and dialectist, because you're going to say that that point is just true. It's just the case, and you can talk about it, and there is no breaking down, there is no problem, and there is no puzzlement, as there is no puzzlement when you say this sentence is false. And finally, well, you have a very clear explanation of what does it mean for an antinomy to stay, because the antinomy can stay and be acceptable finally. And you also know how it can be acceptable, logically acceptable, because it's just true, and you have no problem whatsoever. Okay, so what do we learn? We learn that Tony, I know he will say I'm wrong, but Tony might take very seriously the paraconsistent dialectic option in order to make his own view sound compelling, or more compelling than it already is. And I also think that we learn that in all this debate about the Parmenidean puzzle, an important pivotal role is played by logic. Very often people obsessed over the principle of sufficient reason. I obsessed about it too, big lover of the principle of sufficient reason. I come out of the closet. Yes, I'm one of them. I'm one of the weirdos. That's fantastic. But if we are in the business of thinking about PSR in relation to all these issues, a pivotal role is played by logic and contradictions, because contradictions play a pivotal role. Because Della Rocca faces self-undermining problem in his work as well, which is a version of a paradoxical situation. That's the analogous of Wittgenstein Tractatus. Tony does face an antinomy too, an antinomy that is cogent, exactly for the good reasons he gave us. And then there is me, the dwarf on the shoulders of the giants, of course, which says, you are right. Contradictions play an important role. And they play an important role because they're true. Thanks, guys.
Thank you very much, Filippo, for absolutely fantastic and stimulating talk. Okay, so yeah, I will moderate questions. So either raise your hands virtually, physically, or if you're on YouTube, go ahead and put your questions in. So the floor is open. Who would like to begin? Tony, yes, if I may, Tony, yeah, please, the floor is yours. You're still muted.
Okay, so yeah, thank you very much, Filippo. We talked about these issues a bit, and I'm always fascinated by the way that you amend what I'm trying to do.
No, never, Tony, never.
Yes, sure. First of all, I will start just with two smaller points, not with the main issue, just to get these things clear. You make me more sophisticated than my position is, I think, in some cases. So the S cognitive and the I cognitive, that sounds unfamiliar. I just was thinking of sensory and intentional. So there's intentional consciousness and sensory consciousness. And sensory consciousness is what many people think we share with animals, with higher developed perceiving perceptible animals that are capable of perceiving. And then there's this thesis that you mentioned that qualia are what are, in a way, sensed. And I would say that qualia ain't in the head, but out there where things are. So qualia, and this is this is the reason that I say that we share a field of consciousness. Consciousness isn't in the head either. So if qualia are the content of qualitative sensory consciousness and aren't in the head, then our consciousness isn't in the head. It's out there. It's a common scene. It's a common field of consciousness that we all share, and that each of us structures and coordinates egocentrically. But it's common. It's a common field of consciousness, of qualitative sensory consciousness. And then intentional cognitive states are discursive, predicative, propositional states, linguistic states, as you said. Now, the interesting question is if there's a kind of thinking that goes between.
Yep.
So the tradition always has supposed there is such a kind of thinking, kind of intuitive thinking, whatever you want to call it. And the qualia of this kind of thinking for Aristotle and for Plato at least, weren't sensory qualia, but formal qualia. Though Aristotle in De Anima also has the proper sensibles, which are qualia and just perceived, not thought. And Hegel's logic, I think, is about these quasi-qualia. Like being, or being there, becoming, and something and the other, and all that. These are simple pre-predicative contents of thought. Well, I shouldn't talk of contents. I accept Kimhi's rejection of Frege's difference. So they are forceful but pre-predicative thoughts. And it seems to me you reckon them to the side of the S-cognitive, sensory cognitive, but because they're not intentional. They're not intentional. There's no subject-object difference there. So there's something in between. And I would claim that the antinomy thesis is valid even there.
I see.
Even in Hegel's logic, for example,
I see.
So the antinomy of negation starts with pre-predicative thinking, which is something which we cannot isolate any longer. Since we are thinking intentionally, this is something which lies in our back. So I think there is no way for us to say, well, let's try to think intuitively. But this is something which is an aspect of thinking. Okay, so this is one thing that I wanted to point out. The other thing is the esoteric gesture. I think I have a different interpretation of what Kimhi means. Maybe I'm totally wrong, or I have just misunderstood you in your presentation. There's a way that you can display a thought in speech by uttering a proposition and asserting it. And there's a way to just gesture at a thought or a proposition. So that's the, as I read Kimhi. And like his example, like gesturing at killing someone, threatening something by this gesture. So in a negation, when I say snow is not white or snow is not green, then there is the assertion snow is white or snow is green. But I'm not it doesn't display itself, it's just a gesture. So if I say snow is white, in that mood, I'm only gesturing at this thought and not really displaying it, at this assertion. And this is the reason why I said, okay, if you negate, you're already in a kind of meta-language. I was thinking of Wilfrid Saller's dot quotation here. And so if you are thinking snow is not white or snow is not green, this simple not has already a meta-linguistic flavor. And this goes with all truth propositional operations, like the truth functions. So this is amazing, but it follows from Kim He's approach, and I think he's right in that.
Yeah.
So I would say negativity, strictly speaking, is not in the object language. And so then also the antinomy of negation can't be in the object language when you're just talking about how things are.
Yeah.
The antinomy of negativity or of negation starts with the meta language.
Mhm.
And thinking starts, of course, with a meta language. We can't have the object language on its own. So the source of this antinomy is in thinking. Perhaps that's a way to save the phenomena in the world. As long as we are strictly thinking and talking about things, objects in the object language, there is no danger, no threatening of an antinomy. But as soon as we negate or put things together in truth functions and so on, then we are in thinking, and this thinking has its root in the antinomy. Okay. I'm not sure whether that made anything clearer or still more weird, my position.
No, can I ask you something, Tony, just to be sure? I am trying to present the antinomy of negation. For me, for what I want to say, it's important that there is an antinomy. Because I want to grant that to you, right? I want to say, well, okay, like you're right, there's an antinomy. What you just said, is it meant to suggest that my reconstruction of the antinomy might not be faithful to your view?
Okay, fine. The antinomy is your reconstruction of the antinomy. That's fine. Yeah, sure.
Oh, okay. The reconstruction, you think it's fine? Okay, okay.
Well,
I get it. I see.
Well,
I see.
Yeah, you didn't. Did you reconstruct it or just mention it affirmatively?
I tried to reconstruct it, I guess, but
yeah.
Yeah,
Well,
for me, it's important that there is something that you shouldn't be able to say in the I cognitive.
Okay.
And that is exactly the shift. That is exactly what is required to you to do if you want to explain the shift from S to I. That's my point. Would you agree with that?
Yes, yeah, sure,
Okay,
sure, yeah,
okay, that's right, yeah.
Yeah, okay.
Okay,
And
that's great. Thank
my
you.
point about the putting the antinomy in logical quarantine is this. I think this cannot be formalized.
Yeah.
It's something that that needs phronesis, practical wisdom. So yes, we put it in quarantine, in logical quarantine, but you want to give a calculus or a formalization of logic that does that for us.
Yes. No, that's great, Tony. It's the appealing to phronesis. It's very helpful for me. Can I just ask you something? When you for me, the appealing to phronesis, the appealing to this practical wisdom is about things like shall I this is it's a simplification, right? But just to give you the feeling of what I have in mind when you talk about practical wisdom, like my idea is, okay, I really want to work. Shall I send my kid to pre-K or because if my kid is around, I can't work, or it's better for me to stay with the kid and then work when he's a little bit older, like that, and then I apply some practical wisdom, and I think, well, sure, it's better for me to stay with the kid, and and I can work at 4 o'clock in the night, which is something that is happening, right? But when we talk about logical relations, then asking someone to use practical wisdom really smells to me almost like a categorical mistake. Like logical relations are not the kind of thing that you fix with practical wisdom. Do you know what I mean, Tony? That's my, yeah.
You're muted.
I'll now stop talking and leave the discussion to all of you. Thank you.
Thank you, Tony. Thank you very much.
I think next we have Michael and then Alex, and then I'll have a question. So Michael's floor is yours.
Okay, thank you, Filippo. That was great. I really enjoyed
you,
this
Michael.
paper, and I
you
found
very
it very clear. I heard an earlier version of it a couple months ago, and this is even better.
But
And
I'm happy for the rest of the day. See, I'm a simple person. Now I can go home.
Okay. I want to pick up just on the notion of practical wisdom that you were just talking about with Tony, because I think that was really important. And I wanted to get to the bottom of why you wanted not to take a Wittgensteinian move. And you said you felt comfortable stepping away from Wittgenstein, and that the notion of practical wisdom um, uh, is problematic here, because I think that's really a deep point now that I see that you brought out very well in Tony's thought about all this, that in a way our attitude toward these contradictions is kind of like an existential posture or something, I think you put it.
Yeah.
And that requires a kind of, or manifests a kind of practical wisdom, which may be not able to be put in terms like of a propositional attitude or anything like that. It may be so that I find very attractive, and I think that's maybe in line with some of my thinking here. And so something that I think your response is distinguishing this kind of logical acceptability, and you make it, and I do grant you make it logically acceptable through this paraconsistent logic, that I have no trouble with. But you're distinguishing that from practical wisdom. So there's a distinction between the practical and theoretical here that's really central to your approach. And for me, I'd want to reject the practical and theoretical distinction. So it's all practical wisdom. So in doing logic, that's like practical wisdom too, right? Yep. In a way. So you seem to retain the dualism between the theoretical and the practical, and you really insist on that to save logic, as it were, through this paraconsistent logic. I think Tony also has a distinction between practical and theoretical, and I just want to give up that practical theoretical distinction. I like practical wisdom, but I think it's all practical wisdom. That's all there is. Yeah. So that's just an observation that you really helped me clarify things through the paper today.
I think this is one of the new things I thought, compared to the presentation that you heard, I don't know, 1 year ago, I don't know. This is one of the new elements that I try to kind of be a little bit more precise in spelling out what makes me unhappy of the practical wisdom solution. So I think you're right about that. So let me play a Della Rocca card. Let's see if it works against Della Rocca. So no, look, I'm not making a point. I'm making a dialogical point here.
Yeah.
So what I'm saying is not it's important to have the distinction between practical and the practical and the logical and the theoretical. And if you have this distinction, then you can fix a logical problem by appealing to the practical wisdom, because they're just two different things. I don't want to make that claim. I want to make the claim that Tony's remarks are supposed to convince people or to be compelling for people who are happy with that distinction. And if you reply in that way to people that are happy with that distinction, then that reply will misfire, because they will tell you, wait, but a logical problem is not a practical problem. Now, if you ask me, I might tell you another story about practical wisdom and logical wisdom, like, and sorry, practical wisdom and logical problems. Like I'm recently, I'm writing something for Pippin and his last book, The Culmination, and what I keep telling him is, but if you buy, it's not that if you buy a true contradiction, you kind of avoid the existential issues that you kind of raise in your. No. The true contradiction gives you a new insight into the existential issues. So I see the logical and the existential, or the practical and the theoretical, really close. But the point that I want to make in my paper, this presentation, is if Tony is supposed to convince someone who does believe in that distinction by appealing to practical wisdom per se, that criticism will not work, because they will say, wait, but this is not about when I should send the kids to school. This is about inferences.
Right. Okay. So
you know what I mean?
So right, I think I do know what you mean, and I think I see the point that you're making against Tony, and the point that I was making wasn't it was agreeing with, I think, Tony to some extent, but wasn't defending Tony down the line.
Yeah, I know.
Right. So because I want to reject the theoretical practical distinction, and I think both you and Tony in different ways accept some form of that distinction. But I'm happy to give primacy to practical wisdom. I was just saying that because it's all practical wisdom, but I give primacy to practical wisdom and reject the notion of a distinction between theoretical and practical. And so that's sort of, but anyway, I think this really presents it in a very good light, very interesting. I see the motivations for your view and Tony's view much better after this presentation.
Thank you, Michael. Thank you very much. Happy for the rest of the day, guys. Can go to the pub.
Okay, we have Alex. I think we just yeah, go for it.
Thank you, Greg, and thank you, Filippo, for this inspiring paper. I'm learning so much, and I'm really sorry if I weigh in on a debate that I don't know very well. It's the same topics I deal with, but from a different perspective. So I will just, I have a lot to catch up on, and I look forward to it. But for now, just a very general point, and I try not to be too trivial. I was very interested in the slide when you were referring to Professor Koch's idea that the antinomy must stay but still be unacceptable, so to say. And you were trying to fix this in a way. You were arguing this is not acceptable, so to say. We must, in a way, make the antinomy acceptable. And this idea that the antinomy must stay really reminded me of a Hegelian gesture in the science of logic, when Hegel says, listen, in the end, dialectical logic is a logic that holds to contradiction. This holding to contradiction maybe resonates with this idea that the antinomy must stay. And in a way, I must, this is maybe where me and Gregory don't agree on, and which makes this so exciting. I'm often under the impression that there is a very classical gesture in dialecticism that is trying to fix antinomies. So that is trying to solve the problem. So there is still, so to say, a gesture that is very typical of classical logic. That is, I see a problem and I must solve it, and I must find a way to make it consistent, to make it coherent, etc., etc. Whereas maybe a way of reading that Hegel quote is, by doing this, you are neutralizing contradiction. So you are basically making the caffeinated contradiction. You are making a contradiction that doesn't do anything anymore. And in the way, so I believe that staying true to contradiction maybe could also be precisely stating that it is unacceptable and it stays, which puts everything in motion. And I say this just because of one point that to me is very relevant when I deal with dialectic interpretations of Hegel. To me, the problem is precisely the idea that a contradiction can be true. Namely, the problem that, if you frame the problem in a way that still implies that a contradiction is either false or true, that's a huge problem from an Hegelian point of view. So maybe, the question in a summary, in a bullet point is, isn't this idea that contradiction has to be fixed, that the antinomy must be solved, a last remnant of a classical approach, a classical logical approach?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. So don't worry about asking things you're not familiar with. I gave a whole presentation about things that I'm not familiar with, Alison. So, right
Well,
now,
I just realized I wasn't.
think about
I
that.
just realized I was invisible. Sorry, I didn't want
don't worry.
to look like an absolute speaker from nowhere. But
Yeah, no,
don't
worry. It was great. It was great.
Trick.
So let me tell you what I think. I don't know if this is what dialectics would tell you. I don't even know if this is, so to speak, orthodoxy among them. But this is how I see it. So it seems to me that you said two things, and both of them were very interesting. So the first one is, but isn't something at the end of the day very classical about dialecticism? That is, when you see a contradiction, you see a problem and you want to fix it. And that's what a classical logician would say: see a problem and want to fix it. Maybe you fix it in different ways, but what you have in common with a classical logician is when you see a contradiction, you see a problem. And that's the first thing you said. And the second thing you said is about Hegel and this sort of narrow way of engaging with contradictions, such that either they're true or they're false, but maybe the philosophical scenario is richer, and maybe the philosophical scenario is as such that some contradiction can just be unavoidable and unacceptable, so for some reason. So something like Tony's sort of quotation suggested. So let me say something about the first thing. So how I see dialecticism is slightly different. I think I always present dialecticism as a view which doesn't fix the problem, but doesn't solve the problem, but dissolve the problem. And the reason why I think this is the case is that the difference between a classical logician is exactly that in bumping into a contradiction, he sees the problem. But the dialectist would say, you see the problem because you have this sort of intematic assumption such that contradictions are problematic. Mm-hmm. If you just remove that hidden assumption sneaked into your logic, then it's not that you have a problem that you need to fix. You just don't have a problem anymore because what you did is just right. Don't change anything. You did everything right. So in this sense, the dialectist is very Wittgensteinian in a sense, because instead of hammering the fact that there is a problem and then we need to fix it now, either revising the assumptions or understanding where the argument was invalid, the dialectist says, you believe there is a problem because you are narrow-minded and you think that the only available logic is the one according to which that is a problem. But that problem is actually not there. It's just a fabrication of you thinking that there is only one logic and that that logic is classical. So this is how I would sort of disentangle the classical element of the dialectics paraconsistent approach that you kind of outlined. The second part of the question is about Hegel. And so Hegel, when Greg is in the room, I prefer to shut up. So Hegel is not my business. I'm not a scholar, I don't know. But let me say something about this idea that, well, maybe there is something that contradictions can do more than just being true or false or representing a logical problem. Maybe some contradictions are there and they're meant to stay, and even though they're unacceptable, right? Now, I hate when people with PhDs from the Ivy League universities reply to me by saying, oh, I don't understand this. Because it's not true that they don't understand it. What they want to say is, I disagree with you. That's okay, right? Mm-hmm. But they always say, oh, I really don't understand. What do you mean? I don't understand. No. In this case, though, I must play the same card. I just don't understand what it means. Like, I don't understand what it means for a contradiction to stay and being unacceptable. And one of the things that makes me not understanding what's happening here is that I think that there is an equivocation between staying and acceptable. Because when they say, well, a contradiction is meant to stay, it means that you have logically proven it. You have reasons to believe that that contradiction cannot be avoided. Those reasons are usually logical, since we do philosophy and we present arguments. But when they say then, but we need to accept it, I have the feeling that it's not acceptable logically, but some sort of existentially, I must, yeah, okay, now I need to cope with this problem. I discover I'm sick, so you know what? Better for me to go to the hospital. So it seems to me that there is this shift between attitude, between, on the one side, well, it's logical, it's meant to stay. I mean, the premises are correct and the inferences are right, but then it's still unacceptable, but clearly not logically unacceptable, because logically it's meant to stay. So it's meant to be unacceptable under some other respects, and I generally don't understand which respects are. If not, this is why I like Tony so much, because it's upfront. It's not some sort of logical wisdom, sort of practical wisdom. And then again, I struggle because my Grand Priest indoctrinated brain struggles to shift from arguments, conclusions to practical wisdom. For me, that's a matter of logic. It's not a matter of practical wisdom. So I'm sorry to say, but I just don't understand when people say, well, you know, it's meant to stay, but it's still unacceptable. I'm horrified by this card, but I'm going to play it because I think that's the right moment. I just don't really understand what they mean, if this makes sense to you.
Well, it does, and I would have one reply to both of your answers, but I believe for time reasons this will be a great start for another discussion. So I will just hold to my answers and let Gregory
email me.
Greg ask this question, then I will write you an email, and maybe we can go on with the conversation throughout the seminar. So
absolutely,
but it's very, very interesting. I get your points. So
thank you very much, Alessandro.
Great. So I'll take the privilege of as today's host to ask a few questions.
Absolutely.
For my list of questions here. I have some systematic questions and maybe a historical question or two, which is usual for me. So I really enjoyed the talk. Not only the spirit of it, but the conclusions I agree with. So I want to try to plumb the depths a bit and find places of questioning that will be of use to both of us, since I'm very close to the spirit and the letter of your thinking. My first question is about the meta and object language, because you spoke about it in respect to Tony's views, and I'm curious about your views on this. And my own position on this is that it does make good sense to me to argue that the distinction between object and meta language is grounded in things. That seems very reasonable, and the example was very nice. But then I would also say that the overcoming of the distinction is also grounded in things. But what I would, for example, consider is, say, the absolute thing or the all-encompassing being. And that when we think about this, the distinction collapses or is overcome. So when you think about, for example, Hegel's science of logic, thinking about thinking, when the object thought about is the method by which I think, then the distinction between the object and meta language is overcome. So with absolute thinking, where I'm thinking about the absolute, this is the absolute's thinking about itself, for example. So I tend to think that whereas exactly the distinction is grounded in things, there is the absolute, and it is what destroys or annihilates the distinction in the end. So this is also my gesture to the Della Rocca camp as well on this side. Yeah. Okay, so absolute thinking calls for the overcoming of the distinction. Although I do want to hold on to distinctions, I do think that absolute thinking calls for this. And so that's my first question. And my second question is about, I really enjoyed the antinomy as at least your reconstruction of Tony's antinomy. Whether that actually is Tony's or not, the reconstruction is nice because it also is a reiteration of old problems, not only back to Parmenides, but the classic German idealism problem. It's in different terms, okay? They're not talking about propositional content, but they're talking about, say, how do you, given that the first principle is purely thetic, right? How do you get a non-thetic result, right? How do you, beginning from without distinction at all, can you generate a distinction, right? And that's a question that Fichte, Schelling, Schlegel, Hegel all raised that same question. So it's kind of beautiful to see you within a discourse in analytic philosophy in the 21st century, reiterate with different language the one could say motivating problem, at least in theoretical philosophy of German idealism. As Schelling would say, you know, when I begin with the non-finite, how do I get to finitude? Okay, it's just, of course, very different language, but one can reconstruct the concepts, I think, in similar ways. Okay, so it's not a new problem. We're just reiterating old problems again. So I'm just curious. That's my historical point. Historical question back to you. Whether I don't know how familiar you are with all that stuff, but I'm curious if you see an analogy or if you think there's something different about the problem that we're dealing with now. The solution I generally agree with, but I wanted to ask you about the solution, this new logic. We need a new logic, but there's, I think that's how I read Hegel, is offering a new logic that would say that the Parmenidean puzzle is not a puzzle, as you say. Just not a puzzle. It's not a puzzle. I like the idea that classical logic, and I would put it really strongly, is self-trivializing, or that the antinomy that arises is an antinomy that arises because of the character of classical logic. The classical logic itself undermines itself. And that's why, what is thinking really? Thinking is not thinking classically, according to classical logic. That's not thinking. Thinking is thinking paraconsistently, because it's only this kind of thinking that doesn't trivialize itself. So what I would I would make the same strong claim that I like Tony's strong claim. Make the same strong claim, but in reverse. Actually. So that's I want to know if you're with me in making this strong claim in reverse or not. And lastly, sorry, I know I have a long laundry list here of issues because I'm just so very inspired by the talk, is why it is we need a new logic. Why do you go to a new logic, and instead, why don't you advocate for, say, a mystical transcendence, or this kind of, through the self-destruction of logic, we show in the Wittgensteinian way that the truth cannot be said, but can only be shown. So why not do that, or something like this? Does it have to do with the PSR? Because I'm wondering, like, there's a whole tradition which says that the PSR has limited scope, and that there are simply some facts for which one just cannot give an account. There are no reasons for it. It's just a brute inconsistency, or just this brute impossibility that's without why. We just, this ohne warum. And I'm wondering, what is it, how do we decide whether we should follow you down the path of paraconsistent logic, or go down a traditional mystical route instead, or simply have a contingency, as some continental philosophers like to speak of. Right. There are these brute contingent facts without why, this brute inconsistency that, like death, we just have to deal with practically, to take up maybe something Tony was hinting at. So there's too many questions for the very last of the conference, but thanks a lot for the talks.
Thank you, Greg. Thank you. This really stimulating set of questions. Let me see if I can say something about each of them, and if I fail, then you shout back. So the first question was about the difference between object language and meta language. I agree that there is that difference. I don't know if I'm sympathetic with Tony's view and your view. I'm sympathetic with a generally McDowellian, I don't know, approach. Usually I don't have, so I thought about this stuff in relation to Heidegger, because being in the world is often presented as this sort of, similar, especially by Dreyfus, Ogeland. But usually I don't know how to, but I don't, in a sense, I don't have developed thoughts about this distinction, because my way of addressing the Parmenidean puzzle is very much Meinongian. So, and you don't need this distinction. You just need, to relax certain assumptions about thinking, and then you still have the revenge problem, because, as you know better than me, reading Graham, there's no problem in, thinking and speaking about Sherlock Holmes, and it clearly doesn't exist. It's a known being in a certain sense. But then you still have a sort of Parmenidean revenge when you try to think about things that is not an object at all. So if you read my Heidegger, it's exactly the same. So I just read Heidegger exactly in the same way. So So I don't feel like I have much to say. I do feel that I'm sympathetic, that if I need to take that distinction very seriously as I do, I'm very much sympathetic with this sort of Pittsburgh school approach and the one you were outlining before. Now, the second question was about the importance of the historical importance of Tony's project and my way of reconstructing the paradox or the antinomy of negation. I absolutely agree with you. This is why I started to read a lot of German idealism recently. And I also realized that I'm a bit obsessed with this at the moment because I'm working on it. I also think that Pippin is right in a sense about Heidegger, because if the problem, or if one of the problems of German idealism is how you go from this sort of not finite to the finite, to the undifferentiate to the differentiate, I do think that this is an old, in Italy we say it's old like my grandma. So it's a very old problem. You find it in Plotinus, you know, in the Nedes, you find it in Christian mysticism. Meister Eckhart is all like this. I believe there is a version of Meister Eckhart. You find it in German idealism, and you find it in Heidegger. Now, Heidegger has been unfortunately jettisoned by a cluster of scholars, especially Anglo-American scholars. But a lot of the literature, the German, the European literature about Heidegger, sees Heidegger in perfect continuity with the problems of German idealism and the problem of German mysticism and the problem of the Neoplatonic tradition. Because in Heidegger, if you think that being is this non-entity, purely undifferentiated, with property-less, so to speak, and then you want to explain how everything is grounded upon it, then you find exactly the same problem, which is the same problem of Michael in the Parmenidean ascent, and his solution is to jettison the very necessity of that relation between the origin and the world, because there is no world.
Exactly.
So it's done. Okay. And Heidegger is unhappy because he wants to maintain the world, right? He wants to give, you know, he wants the finite and he wants the infinite. He wants the pure being too. So I think I agree with you. I started to read Confession. I started to think about this stuff, reading the beautiful volume that you edited for Springer on non-being.
Do you mean indeterminacy?
No, the other one.
Did I do? Oh yeah, negation. Sorry,
Negation.
I forgot. Yeah.
There are a lot, yes. There are a lot
Yeah.
of papers on non-being.
Being of negation. Yeah.
Exactly, the being of negation, that is not, you know, in a sense, it's non-being. And the problem is exactly the same, and it's the same problem of Nishida, because the basho, the place of all places, you have the same problem, this sort of things that doesn't like in any place, and therefore it is without any distinction, so to speak, is unpredicable, it's pre-predicative, so to speak, and then the rest, all the other places. So this is a very old problem in philosophy, and what I'm absolutely convinced, and this is my firm belief, is that this problem is triggered by the attempt to rigorously apply PSR, because you are never happy to stop with anything. You need the bottom, and the bottom is going to be this sort of weird, magmatic, non-self-identity thing, you know, and you get as weird as you want. But that very process of asking the question, but why this? Think about Nishida. Why this place and not this one? But then, okay, why this place and not this one? Think about Heidegger. Take an entity. Okay, why this entity? Because of this. Why because of this? Because it's an application of the PSR in a sense. And I think that if you apply PSR rigorously without any taming in a sense, then you end up facing some paradoxes, which is what all these people face, because the Neoplatonic tradition, the German idealistic tradition, the mystical tradition, Heidegger, Nishida, half of the Kyoto school are all about this attempt to square together a fully comprehensive explanation of everything with something that appears to be inconsistent. Now, some of us might want to take that inconsistent to be true. Some other people might want to say, no, that's just a reason to deny the multitude, like Michael. Some other people, like Tony, might have another story, and so on and so forth. But it looks to me really difficult to deny that the combination, the PSR puts some sort of pressure of PNC, right? Then what we do with that pressure, we can debate. But it seems to me that there is this tension. So I completely agree with you. I read a part of history of philosophy in the same way. So I'm now engaging in this kamikaze project, my dream, of writing the sort of dark side of the moon of the Parmenidean ascent, where I grant to Michael everything and I just, with historical examples, and I just show that, sure, there are people postulating this sort of brute facts, or trying not to, but failing, but there are also another tradition that is very Aristotelian to me. The tradition that Michael is looking at looks to me very Aristotelian. But then there is also the Neoplatonic tradition, which not only agrees with Michael, but put pressure on PSR. Then we can debate exegetically if I'm right or wrong, that Heidegger is a dialetist, and we can think that Casati is horribly wrong about Heidegger, and we can write on Facebook nasty comments. That's great. But the fact that Heidegger sees P&C under pressure by PSR, that looks to me completely consistent with the tradition in which he works, which is the German idealistic tradition, Neoplatonic tradition, the mystical tradition, and so on and so forth. So this is what I would say to that question. Can I add one thing about the new logic, why we don't go mystical?
Yes, please. Of course.
So now, why do we need a new logic and we just don't go mystical? The answer is because I'm not convinced by the mystical approach. So why I'm not convinced with the mystical approach? Because for me, the most developed approach to the mystical, to this sort of a mystical attempt, is developed by Wittgensteinian. If you want to take the mystical very seriously and not like another step of the ladder that you want to jettison, then you need to think that the resolute are wrong and the traditionalists are right. Because if you want to appeal to a sort of a thick notion of showing solution, such that it is given to me what cannot be given to you by thinking, then you need to be traditional because the resolute will deny that. And to me, the traditional just doesn't work exactly for the same reason the resolute things, Anscombe and all the others were Acker, they were wrong. Because you end up in self-defeating, chickening out, Cora Diamond would say. You will inevitably end up in saying something that you cannot say. So because I think that's the most developed way of understanding the mystical approach, and that doesn't work, then I'm tempted to dismiss it.
Wonderful.
Side note, I have this impression that this constitutes a problem for Michael's book. We had this conversation a lot because I'm basically stalking Michael. He will call the police at some point, I'm sure. And the idea here is, like Michael finds himself using a language of revealing, giving to us, showing. There is a paper in Philosophical Studies in which he explicitly mentions showing within brackets or seeing within brackets the German from the Tractatus, even though he doesn't mention the Tractatus directly. And I think that for someone like him, that jargon is very dangerous because showing, seeing are relational concepts, and you cannot apply them if you want to run Michael's story as you want.
I think you probably could have a mystical answer with relations. And then that wouldn't be this, you would have a different, you would still have self-refutation, as you say, but the self-refutation, again, that's the trick of these people. That's why they're slippery, is that the self-refutation is supposed to illustrate what they're trying to, what they can't say. This is why it's so slippery.
I agree. And it seems to me that then we need to check the text, but it seems to me that, for instance, Acker, there is a paper written by Acker, he collected in the new Wittgenstein. It's a beautiful paper. It's a lovely paper. And I think that Cora Diamond there is absolutely right, that Acker, in order to spell this sort of traditional view of showing, he commits himself to things that he shouldn't be able to say, and that for him to say, well, but this is part of the showing, just doesn't do the trick, because then it becomes unclear what does the work if, there's no, exactly. Yeah.
We had one very brief, I think we're already way over, but
Sorry,
Rudd
guys.
also wanted you to restate the puzzle. Exactly why does 2 rule out 1? The very puzzle, the very beginning. Could you just briefly say also for maybe other listeners who...
Yes, of course. So the puzzle is this one. So let's see if I can make it. Wait, let me do this one. So
yeah, very briefly if you can. Sorry.
Yes. So
One
So,
before one.
of
Or-
course. So very briefly, I think that the puzzle is this one. So we seem to be able to talk about things which require negation of falsehood. Negation of, so the first idea is we are able to meaningfully and sensically talk about, to use negation and to assess a statement as false. Right, that's the first corner. And the second one is, let's take the easy, for what for me is the easiest version, then thinking reaching all the way to which it is the case. Now, the problem seems to be that if this is the case, then I shouldn't be able to intelligibly think negation and falsities, because negation and falsities seems to force me to think about what is not the case, which would, of course, lead to to contradict two. So either it is true two, that is, thinking reaches all the way to being, but then it's not true that I can intelligibly think about negation, or if it's true one, that is, I can intelligibly think about negation and falsities, then it must be rejected two, because in so doing, that is, in using negation and assessing statements which are false, I seem to think about what is not the case, and two is telling me that I can think only about what is the case. I don't know if this helps, sorry.
I don't see why two would say that. That's maybe the problem. Why does two exclude the possibility of?
So thinking reaches all the way to being. This is usually understood to thinking always reaches all the way to being only. You can think only what it is. So if you can think only, no.
But why is that? I mean, I can think that snow is
right.
Not green, right? I don't see a problem with that.
Right. But if you object that, then you're not claiming that you don't see the problem. You don't see the incompatibility between one and two. What you're saying is that you don't believe that true is correct, which is another thing, right?
No, the way two is stated here does not seem to contradict one. I mean, if you say that it's only capable of thinking in the positive sense, yeah, then, but that's not what two says in your slide, I think.
It's not me saying this, but it's Kimi. But I can assure you that what Kimi understands two star and two star in a way that it's incompatible with one.
I'm sure it is. I mean, there's many wise guys believing it. I just failed to see it for the moment. That's my look from the outside, causing. By the way, if I may, about the mystical, I think you're jumping to conclusion to the destruction of philosophy completely. The infinite and the finite and how they connect, the source and the manifestation and so on. We can talk about the infinite and even reason to the point that there must be an infinite. And that is perfectly consistent. I have such proof, if you like. And it's the big confusion maybe is that the infinite is not the cause of what appears to be of the manifestation, but it is just a condition.
Yeah, so very few people believe what you said, right?
Yes,
usually and I didn't, nothing that Tony says or I said, or usually it said, talk about causing here. Usually it's spelled out in terms of condition of possibility, metaphysical dependence, ontological dependence, grounding, but not causing, because the causal relation is a relation which happens in time, and the relations we're talking about that Greg was mentioning before, they're not causal, yeah.
Well, I would love to keep the conversation, but I think it's time to go.
Sorry, guys.
We have to start. But thanks so much again, Filippo, for the great talk. And thanks to everybody for coming, for the questions. And I'm looking forward to the next one. Alex, do you want to briefly say when the next one is? We had a...
Yes, we have had a reschedule. Emmanuel Aloa will have his talk on July 19. So this is our next appointment, and he will probably bring in the French. So we will also start to speak about singularity in the French contemporary debate. And again, thank you, Filippo, for your beautiful talk, and thanks
Thank
everyone
you very
for the
much.
beautiful discussion. This is going great, so I'm really
Thank
happy.
you.
I'm
Thanks,
very
everybody. Yeah,
And thank you,
Thanks.
Tony. Thank you, Tony.
Thanks,
Yes.
Thank you,
Filippo.
Greg. Bye. Bye, guys.
Bye.
Thank
Bye.
you. Thank
Bye.
you for
Thank you.
listening.
Thank
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
cheers.